CEO invited his poor ex-wife to his wedding, to disgrace her, but she came in a Rolls-Royce plus twins. The pregnancy test trembled in Esther Birch's hands as she stared at the two pink lines that would shatter her world and rebuild it stronger than ever. After 3 years of marriage and countless conversations about the legacy they'd build together, she was finally carrying Martin's child. Her heart swelled with pure joy as she imagined his reaction to the news. She had planned this moment with meticulous care. Martin's favorite dinner was warming in the oven, jerk chicken from that Caribbean spot in Bronzeville he loved, paired with the bottle of wine they'd been saving since he closed his first major tech deal. Candles flickered across their modest South Loop apartment, casting warm light over the small dining table they'd found at a vintage market on 47th Street. She'd arranged fresh sunflowers, bright and hopeful, in the center, and she'd even framed an ultrasound appointment confirmation to present alongside the test, the words, "Baby Fred, coming soon," written in her careful handwriting. Before we go into details, click subscribe, like, and comment where you're watching from. I would be glad to know this story goes as far as Canada, all of the United States of America, Australia, Africa, and even the United Kingdom, so let me know where you're listening from. At 24, Esther still felt incredibly blessed to be married to Martin H. Fred. When they'd met at that Black Professionals Network mixer 3 years ago, but she'd been a recent Northwestern graduate working as a junior marketing coordinator at a Southside community organization. He was the most driven man who'd ever truly seen her, Howard University educated, a rising tech entrepreneur building his own software company, and devastatingly handsome in those sharp-cut suits he wore like armor. Their courtship had felt like destiny, late nights mapping out dreams at Ethiopian restaurants in Uptown, weekend mornings at Black-owned coffee shops discussing generational wealth, and a proposal at the DuSable Museum that had made her believe they would build something beautiful and lasting together. Tonight she would tell him they were going to be parents, and their story would reach its most sacred chapter yet. The sound of Martin's key in the lock made her pulse quicken with anticipation. She quickly tucked the pregnancy test behind her back, wanting to savor the moment when she saw joy illuminate his face, the face she'd loved for 3 years, the face their child would share. "Martin, baby," she called out, practically glowing with excitement, her voice warm with all the love she'd stored up for this moment. "I have the most incredible news to share with you." Esther Birch had never imagined that love could be so cruel, so calculated. When she told Martin H. Fred about the pregnancy, she expected shock, perhaps fear, maybe even joy beneath the initial surprise. What she got instead was ice, cold, unfeeling, and final. His eyes, once warm with promises whispered in their small apartment, turned flat as polished stone. "I can't do this," he said, adjusting the cufflinks she'd saved 3 months to buy him. "I have plans." "Esther, big plans. A baby doesn't fit into them." Within weeks, the divorce papers arrived via courier. No phone call, no explanation beyond the legal jargon that reduced their marriage to a series of clauses and signatures. Martin took everything, the modest savings they'd accumulated, the car, even the furniture. He left her with nothing but the life growing inside her and a forwarding address to some upscale high-rise downtown where his new life was apparently already waiting. The years that followed were a brutal education in survival. Esther worked 3 jobs while her belly swelled, ignored the pitying looks from neighbors, and delivered twin boys, Malcolm and Marcus, in a county hospital where the fluorescent lights buzzed like angry wasps. She named them after warriors, after men who never surrendered. Because surrender was a luxury she couldn't afford. While Martin climbed the corporate ladder, Esther climbed out of poverty one property at a time. She started with a dilapidated duplex purchased with a loan from a church fund, renovated it herself with YouTube tutorials and sheer determination, and flipped it for double the investment. Then another, and another. Her sons grew up on construction sites, learning measurements before multiplication tables, understanding equity before they understood irony. 10 years later, the invitation arrived in her mailbox like a grenade wrapped in cream-colored cardstock. Martin H. Fred and Mary R. Owen cordially invited her to witness their union at the Grand Belmont estate. The message was clear: come see what you could never be, what you could never have. Esther held that invitation for 3 days, reading it until she'd memorized every pretentious detail. Then she smiled, a slow, dangerous thing that her sons recognized immediately. "Mama's got that look," Malcolm whispered to Marcus. And Mama did indeed have that look, because Martin H. Fred had just made his final fatal mistake. He invited his poor ex-wife to his wedding to disgrace her, but she came in a Rolls-Royce plus twins. Esther Birch stared at the plastic stick in her hand, watching those 2 pink lines materialize like a verdict. Her heart hammered against her ribs, part terror, part wild, irrational joy. A baby, their baby. She pressed one hand against her still flat stomach, imagining Martin's face when she told him, imagining how they'd figure it out together because that's what people in love did. They figured things out. But before we go further into Esther's story, let me speak directly to you. Yes, you, reading these words, carrying your own burdens, nursing your own wounds. I want you to know something. Whatever betrayal you've survived, whatever abandonment has tried to define you, it doesn't get the final word. Your story isn't over. The people who underestimated you, who walked away when you needed them most, who thought your brokenness was permanent, they don't know what you're made of yet. Hold on. Your vindication is coming. Now back to that modest Chicago apartment where Esther waited, rehearsing the words. The place was small, barely 700 square feet, but they'd made it home with second-hand furniture and dreams too big for the cracked ceiling. Martin was due back from another late meeting, another networking event, another rung on the ladder he climbed with religious devotion. When his key finally turned in the lock at nearly midnight, Esther met him at the door, the pregnancy test hidden behind her back like a secret gift. "Martin," she began, her voice trembling with anticipation, "I have something to tell you. It's something wonderful." He set down his briefcase, loosened his tie, and looked at her with eyes already calculating, already distant. Later, she would remember this moment and realize she'd seen it then. The absence of warmth, the priorities already reordered in his ambitious mind. But in that moment, foolish with hope, she pulled out the test and showed him. "I'm pregnant," she whispered. "We're going to be parents." The silence that followed wasn't contemplative or shocked. It was cold, methodical. The silence of a man performing mental mathematics, where love should have been, weighing a child against corner offices and stock options, and finding fatherhood wanting. Martin didn't pace. He didn't raise his voice. He simply looked at Esther with the clinical detachment of a man reviewing a failed investment. "I didn't build an empire to play house," he said, each word precise as a scalpel. "I built it to dominate. You and this situation are liabilities I can't afford." The word situation hit Esther like a physical blow. Not baby, not our child. Situation. "Martin, please," she started. But he was already pulling his phone from his pocket, scrolling through contacts with the casual efficiency of a man scheduling a dental appointment. "My lawyer will handle the paperwork. You'll sign, take whatever settlement he offers, and we'll both move forward. This doesn't have to be complicated." He paused at the bedroom door. "You were nothing but a mistake, Esther. A distraction I can't afford anymore." The divorce was swift and surgical. Martin's attorneys were thorough, and stripping Esther of everything except her clothes and the life growing inside her. She told herself she was strong, that she could measure her worth without his validation. But late at night, alone in a women's shelter with her hand on her swelling belly, the words echoed, "You were nothing but a mistake." 5 years swept by like a storm. Brutal, transformative, unstoppable. Esther discovered she was carrying twins on the same day the shelter told her they'd run out of bed space. She delivered Malcolm and Marcus in a county hospital, held them both against her chest, and made a promise. They would never know poverty as permanent, never know abandonment as destiny. She worked. God, how she worked, cleaning offices at night while the boys slept in a donated playpen, studying real estate regulations during her lunch breaks. And she bought her first property, a condemned duplex, with a church loan and pure audacity, renovating it herself with YouTube tutorials and relentless determination. 1 property became 2, 2 became 5. 5 became Birch and Crown Properties, a luxury real estate empire that catered to the same elite circles Martin now inhabited. Esther learned to speak their language, wear their armor, and beat them at their own game. But she did it draped in vibrant African prints that announced she would never erase herself to fit their comfort. When the invitation arrived, cream cardstock, gold embossing, Martin H. Fred and Mary R. Owen request your presence, Esther checked the venue address and smiled. The Grand Belmont Estate, property she'd acquired 6 months ago through a subsidiary. And Martin had just invited her to her own building to witness his triumph. The irony was delicious. The 2 pink lines appeared like prophecy. Esther sat on the edge of their chrome and marble bathtub in the upscale Chicago loft Martin had insisted they lease. "Image matters in my industry," he'd said, and felt her entire world tilt on its axis. A baby. Their baby. She imagined it all in that moment. Family dinners around the custom Italian dining table, bedtime stories read in voices thick with love, a legacy built not just of money but of meaning. She could see Martin teaching their child to ride a bike, could hear laughter echoing through rooms that had only ever known the click of laptop keys and the murmur of conference calls. Down the hall, Martin sat in his home office, 3 monitors glowing like altars to ambition, reviewing merger documents that would expand his tech empire into 6 new markets. Esther stood in the doorway, a pregnancy test trembling in her hand, and watched him work for a moment before speaking. Even then, some instinct whispered warning, but love, foolish and stubborn, refused to listen. "Martin," she said softly, "I need to tell you something." He didn't look up from the spreadsheet. "Make it quick. I have a 7 a.m. call with Singapore." She told him anyway, hope bleeding through every word. What followed wasn't an argument. Arguments implied 2 people fighting for the same thing. This was an execution, swift, merciless, predetermined. Martin leaned back in his leather chair, steepled his fingers, and delivered his verdict with the cold precision of a man trained to cut losses without sentiment. "You were supposed to be an asset, Esther. Instead, you're debt." He opened a drawer, pulled out a manila folder, already prepared. She realized with dawning horror, and slid it across the desk. "My attorney drafted these yesterday. You have 48 hours to vacate." "Yesterday?" The word barely made it past her lips. "You knew? How did you—" "I saw the pregnancy test in the bathroom trash 3 days ago. I've been making arrangements." He returned his attention to the monitors, dismissing her with indifference more cutting than any rage. "You were an anchor on a ship meant to soar. I'm cutting the rope before we both drown." 47 hours later, Esther stood outside Cook County Women's Shelter with 2 garbage bags containing everything Martin's lawyers hadn't claimed. Inside her, twins she didn't yet know about were already fighting for space, already teaching her that survival required taking up room even when the world wanted you small. But the courier arrived at Birch and Crown Properties just before noon, carrying an envelope so ostentatiously elegant it practically announced its own importance. Cream cardstock with gold embossed edges, the kind of stationery that whispered old money and new arrogance in equal measure. Esther's assistant, Diana, brought it into the penthouse office with raised eyebrows. "Hand delivered. The messenger said it was of utmost personal importance. She set it on the glass desk overlooking Michigan Avenue, where the Chicago skyline sprawled like a kingdom Esther had conquered one property at a time. Esther didn't open it immediately. She finished reviewing the acquisition proposal for a lakefront development first, signed off on the luxury condo conversion in River North, yet then poured herself a glass of water from the crystal pitcher that had cost more than her first month's rent at the shelter. Only then did she slide one perfectly manicured nail beneath the seal. Martin H. Fred and Mary R. Owen cordially invite you to witness their union in matrimony at the Rosewood estate. The date, the time, black tie required, and there, in smaller script at the bottom, almost an afterthought. We hope you can attend this joyous celebration of love and success. Esther read it twice, her expression never changing. Then she turned to her computer, pulled up her company's holdings database, and typed in the Rosewood Estate's address. The property deed appeared on screen. Acquired 8 months ago through Birch Capital Holdings, one of her subsidiary LLCs. She'd purchased it from a developer facing bankruptcy, renovated it into a premier event venue, and leased it out for weddings, galas, and corporate retreats. Martin H. Fred had rented her building to humiliate her. The irony was so perfect, so cosmically just, that Esther threw her head back and laughed, a sound that started low and built into something powerful, uncontainable. Diana poked her head back in, concerned. "Everything okay, Ms. Birch?" Esther held up the invitation, still smiling that dangerous smile her sons knew so well. "Diana, clear my calendar for next Saturday. And call Bernard. Tell him to have the Phantom detailed and ready. I have a wedding to attend." "Should I send a gift?" Esther's smile widened. "Oh, I'll be bringing gifts. 2 of them. They're 5 years old, brilliant, and look exactly like their father." The Rolls-Royce Phantom appeared like a midnight prophecy. Gliding up the Rosewood Estate's circular drive with the kind of silence that made people stop mid-conversation and stare. The car was flawless, obsidian paint so deep it seemed to absorb light, chrome accents catching the afternoon sun like declarations of intent. Photographers who'd been lounging near the red carpet scrambled to attention, cameras already clicking before they even knew who was arriving. This wasn't on the guest list they'd been given, wasn't one of the expected society arrivals. This was something else entirely. The chauffeur, Bernard, who'd driven Esther to her first major property closing and every significant moment since, stepped out with practiced elegance and moved to the rear door. The crowd pressed closer, craning necks, whispering speculation. The door opened. Esther emerged like royalty returning from exile, and the collective gasp was audible even over the fountain's splash. She wore gold, not the timid, apologetic gold of someone trying to belong, but the bold, unapologetic gold of African queens and sun goddesses. Her Gil head wrap rose in elaborate, perfect folds, a crown that announced her heritage and her power in the same breath. The matching dress was a masterpiece of Ankara fabric and haute couture construction, Belle's sleeves flowing like wings, every line celebrating curves that had carried and birthed and survived. Her skin glowed, not with makeup, though her face was flawlessly painted, but with the radiance of a woman who'd walked through fire and emerged tempered into something unbreakable. But Esther wasn't alone. The car's other doors opened, and 2 small figures stepped out on either side of her like miniature kings flanking their queen. Malcolm and Marcus, 5 years old and devastating in matching gold dashikis, their faces serious and beautiful, their resemblance to Martin H. Fred so undeniable that several wedding guests actually stumbled backward in shock. They each took one of their mother's hands, standing tall despite their size, already learning that presence had nothing to do with height and everything to do with knowing your worth. The cameras exploded into a frenzy. Flashbulbs popped like fireworks. Someone dropped a champagne glass, the crystal shattering against marble with a sound like breaking illusions. Esther didn't hurry. She walked that red carpet with the measured grace of a woman who owned it, which technically she did. Every step was deliberate. A sermon delivered in gold and melanin and undeniable truth. Inside the estate, Martin H. Fred was about to discover that some women don't break. They rebuild, and they return draped in glory. Martin spotted her from across the grand foyer, and for a split second, something flickered across his face. Confusion, perhaps recognition, before his features settled into that practiced smirk of superiority. He excused himself from a cluster of investors and approached with the swagger of a man on his own territory. "Esther," he said, loud enough for nearby guests to hear, "I'm touched you came. Though I must say, the costume is a bit much, don't you think? This is a sophisticated affair, not a cultural festival." The insult landed exactly where he intended. Several guests tittered nervously. Others looked away in second-hand embarrassment. Martin's fiancée, Mary, materialized at his elbow in her pristine white gown, curiosity and condescension mixing on her delicate features. Esther didn't flinch. If she simply smiled that dangerous smile and adjusted one of her Jeel's elegant folds with the casual grace of a woman entirely comfortable in her power. "Actually, Martin, I think the estate looks lovely. My interior designer did exceptional work with the floral arrangements, and the catering team I hired has really outdone themselves, though I see you upgraded to the premium bar package. Good choice." She paused, letting the words settle like dominoes waiting to fall. "I do hope you're enjoying the venue. The Rosewood Estate has such beautiful bones. I should know. I bought it 8 months ago through Birch Capital Holdings." The color drained from Martin's face so quickly he looked almost translucent. "You... what?" "Own it," Esther clarified, her voice carrying the kind of patient clarity one might use with a slow child. "The property of the building you're standing in, the chairs you're sitting on, the very ground beneath your overpriced Italian loafers." She gestured around the opulent space with one graceful hand. "I coordinated your entire wedding, Martin. You've been paying rent to me for months without knowing it." Mary's grip on Martin's arm tightened, her expression shifting from superiority to calculation. But Esther wasn't finished. She looked down at Malcolm and Marcus, who'd been standing perfectly still, perfectly patient, waiting for their cue. "Boys," she said gently, "say hello to your father." They stepped forward in unison, 2 pairs of eyes, Martin's eyes, undeniably his eyes, staring up at the man who'd called them a liability before they'd even drawn breath. "Hello, Father," they said together, their voices clear and strong and absolutely devastating. And Martin's world didn't just tilt, it shattered, and every powerful person in that room bore witness to the breaking. Mary R. Owen was many things: heiress, socialite, strategically ambitious, but she wasn't stupid. She watched her groom's face cycle through shock, rage, and something that looked disturbingly like fear, and her mind began calculating with the cold precision of a woman raised to protect family assets above all else. "Martin," she said quietly, her grip on his arm now restraining rather than affectionate, "perhaps we should discuss this privately." But privacy was a luxury Martin no longer possessed. The investors and board members he'd been courting all evening had gravitated closer, drawn by the unmistakable scent of scandal. Theodore Pemberton, chairman of Martin's largest institutional investor, he stood near the champagne fountain, his expression shifting from polite interest to troubled assessment. "Those are your children?" Pemberton asked, his voice carrying the weight of fiduciary responsibility. "The boys you've never mentioned? Not once in 5 years of quarterly meetings?" Martin opened his mouth, but Malcolm, brave, brilliant Malcolm, spoke first. "Our mama says a man's character isn't measured by his successes, but by who he abandons on the way up." The boy's voice was clear, rehearsed but sincere. "Did you abandon us, sir?" The silence that followed was catastrophic. Jennifer Wu, Martin's chief operating officer, pulled out her phone and stepped away, already making calls. Carson Mitchell, the venture capitalist who'd championed Martin's latest expansion, set down his champagne glass with the careful deliberation of a man reconsidering every conversation they'd ever had. "You built your entire brand on family values," Mitchell said slowly, as if testing each word. "The commercials, the foundation, that speech at the shareholders' meeting about legacy and responsibility, and you have twin sons you've never acknowledged?" Mary released Martin's arm entirely, taking one step back, then another. Her father, steel magnate Richard Owen, whose approval had been the crown jewel of this union, appeared from the veranda, his face carved from granite and disapproval. "Mary, darling," he said, not even looking at Martin, "I think we need to have a conversation about today's arrangements." Within the hour, 3 board members had requested emergency meetings, and 2 major contracts were under review. Martin's company stock began a gentle but unmistakable decline that would, by Monday morning, become a free fall. Esther watched it all with the serene detachment of a woman who understood that justice wasn't about revenge. It was about truth finally meeting consequence in a room full of witnesses who could no longer look away. She took her son's hands. "Come on, babies. Let's go home." The penthouse was quiet when they returned, the kind of peaceful silence that only comes after storms have passed and left everything clean in their wake. Esther kicked off her heels, custom Italian leather that had cost more than a month's rent at that long-ago shelter, and watched Malcolm and Marcus race to the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Chicago skyline. "Mama, look!" Marcus pressed his hands against the glass, pointing at the twinkling grid of lights below. "You can see everything from up here." "Everything," Malcolm echoed, his reflection ghosting against the darkening sky. Esther joined them at the window, still wearing her gold jewel, still draped in the armor she'd chosen for battle. But standing here, with her sons on either side, she felt something shift inside her chest, a release perhaps, or a recognition. The city sprawled beneath them like a kingdom she'd conquered one property at a time. Somewhere down there was the shelter where she'd slept on a cot with her hand on her swollen belly. Somewhere was the county hospital where she'd labored alone, bringing these 2 miracles into a world that hadn't wanted them. Somewhere was every closed door, every dismissive laugh, and every person who'd looked at a broke, pregnant black woman and seen nothing worth their time. And somewhere, in some expensive hotel suite, Martin H. Fred was probably making desperate phone calls, trying to salvage a reputation built on the bodies of people he'd deemed expendable. But that wasn't her concern anymore. Malcolm tugged on her dress. "Mama, did we do good today?" She knelt between them, gathering both boys into her arms, breathing in the scent of their hair, shea butter and innocence and infinite possibility. "You did perfect, baby. You both did." "Are we going to see him again?" Marcus asked, his voice small. "Our father?" Esther considered the question carefully, the way she considered all things now, with wisdom earned through suffering and rebuilt through sheer will. "That's up to him, sweetheart. But whether he chooses you or not, you'll always know this. Your mama chose you, every single day. And we built something he could never touch, never diminish, never take away." She stood, looking out at her city, her empire, her life stitched together from scraps and determination, and the audacious belief that a black woman's resilience could transform rejection into royalty. The Rolls-Royce was beautiful. The properties were impressive. Martin's downfall was satisfying. But this, Malcolm's laughter, Marcus's dreams, the unshakable foundation she'd built with her own scarred hands. This was victory. This was empire. This was everything that mattered. Thank you for sticking around with me, my wonderful story family. If you enjoyed the story, click subscribe and let me know in the comments where you're watching from, because tomorrow I will be giving you another story just as interesting as this one, and you don't want to miss it.